Welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. Good afternoon. I am Linda Tabensky, member of the Social Science Program Committee. Our program committees have scheduled 30 programs in this season of our enrichment series as part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Our speaker today, Connie Fairbanks, began her love affair with reading and history as a child in rural Kansas, where she used to browse books on the traveling bookmobile. Connie's credits include her lifelong love of history, for her fascination with history of Chicago's West Loop. She always wanted to chronicle the stories all around her, and Connie and her husband have lived in the West Loop since the mid-1990s, so she has plenty of stories to share. Connie is an accomplished professional who also is known for her culinary flair and has published Scratch That, seasonal menus, and perfect pairings cookbook, and various travel and food articles. Connie's professional background includes launching the first nicotine patch in the U.S. and helped remove smoking from airplanes and with a team. She also helped develop some of the first direct-to-consumer ads on TV for smoking cessation, incontinence, and helped start a medical device company in Boston and take it public. In Chicago, Connie has collaborated as an actor on stage, worked with television crews on cooking segments and commercials throughout the Midwest. As a lover of the arts and education for everyone, Connie believes in giving back to her community. She was a volunteer tutor at the Partners in Education program at the Fourth Presbyterian Church from 1995 to 2020. She leads architectural tours for Frank Lloyd Wright Trust at the Rookery, and also she is Metro Judge for the Chicago History Museum. Connie enjoys gardening and was a 2023 winner of the Chicago Excellence in Gardening Awards. Connie will be talking about her book, Chicago's West Loop, Then and Now, which will be on sale after the program. Welcome, Connie.
Good afternoon and happy 2024. It's hard to believe this building will almost be 100 years old. Pretty amazing. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Becky, and all the tech staff. And thank you, Judith, who is at home, but watching on Zoom. I'm so glad that you're interested in history. You're going to have to stop me if I keep going too long, because I love history as well. And I had a teacher in grade school in my tiny town in Kansas. It was 90 people. We did not have a library, but I had the best teachers. We had 2 grades in one room, so if I didn't get it the first year, I got it the next year. And I used to stand in line at the bookmobile in front of our little post office and waited for the We Were There books. One of my favorites was Jane Addams and the Hull House, and ironically, I live a couple blocks from the Hull House now. So anyway, I'm glad that you're interested in history, and it looks like the Golden Globes were too, with Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project and all the awards they won last night. And I know you're interested in history as well. I'm going to talk about Chicago's West Loop, then and now, and you're probably going, West Loop. I remember it as Greektown or the near West Side. Well, realtors have changed the name to the West Loop. And I focus the book on people, businesses, and buildings. Chicago's West Loop is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Chicago. From everything that we hear on the news, we think it's brand new because of Google and McDonald's. It's not. It goes back to the 1850s. So it's a very long standing neighborhood. I won't be able to, of course, cover the entire book today, but I'm going to highlight some of the various areas. One of the biggest questions I get is, why did I write the book? Part of it, I had lived in the neighborhood for a few years. My husband moved me over from Gold Coast, and it was a little scary when we moved there. There were no people, no cars, just a few dogs and prostitutes. That was about it. But it was a big change, and I loved it. And I wanted to preserve the history before it was all gone. And I will get to it. Not all of it's been torn down, a lot. It's very hard for me to walk around and not think about what happened in that building way before any of us. And I live in a 1908 building. Did you know that the largest incense maker in Chicago is in the West Loop? You can smell it if you go over there. The Lion and Healy harps, known as some of the finest harps in the world, are still made in the West Loop, and they've been there since the 1890s. Suits were made over there. Hartshafter Marx was there, and the Oxford suits were made there. And I like to say both of those buildings are still in existence. The first Congregational church on Ashland and about Washington, across from one of the oldest parks in Chicago, Union Park, has been there since 1869, and it was the home of City Hall after the fire of 1871. This sculpture, the Farber sculpture at Ogden, Madison, and Ashland, was the home of the first stockyard in Chicago. And I wasn't living here then, but in the 60s, there was a turtle wax on top of that corner, and it changed colors with the weather. Can you imagine how the millennials would just love that today? Also, the first pharmacist in Illinois was from the West Loop, and I'm going to talk about that. And how many people have had or have a Schwinn bike? I had one as a kid. Didn't everybody have a Schwinn? And then I have purchased one as an adult as well. And Schwinn bicycles got their start as well. I mentioned this: preserve and document the history of the neighborhood and honor our ancestors and learn from the past. There were a lot of people over here that were pretty famous. Some of you may have heard of the Ziegfeld Follies. Well, I was surprised to find out that Florence Ziegfeld lived in the West Loop. He lived across from Whitney Young High School, where Michelle Obama went, and one of the top high schools in the state, in the country. It's now a basketball court where he lived. And Florence Ziegfeld got his start on Halsted Street, about Monroe and Halsted. He went to a Wild Bill Hickok show and threw some archery, and he won, and Wild Bill Hickok took him on the road with him. And we know that Florence Ziegfeld started the Ziegfeld Follies, and believe it or not, they are still in existence. I have a little letter from them because they let me use a photo, which is in the book. He also produced the Columbian Exposition of 1893. Many of you probably know Bertha Palmer, Palmer House. She lived in the West Loop. She lived on the fashionable Ashland Avenue with all the very wealthy people in Chicago. And she went to the Brown School, which is just past Ashland, and the school is still there. And I don't know if you know, she was kind of famous for the chocolate brownie that was put in a box for the people that visited the 1893 Columbian Exposition. So the brownie comes from her in the Palmer House. Dr. Shipman was somebody that a lot of people don't know, and we should know him. He had a medical office about a block from where I live. Every time I walk by, I think about his waiting room. He left a basket in the waiting room for babies that mothers could not take care of. And this was in 1871, which is pretty amazing. He went on to found the Foundlings Orphanage, and he and his wife took in more than 8,000 babies and 4,000 mothers. And they moved a couple times, and then Rush took it over, and now I think it's gone now. But Mr. Shipman should definitely be remembered. Mr. Philo Carpenter, first pharmacist in Illinois. He and his wife were abolitionists. He would hide runaway slaves in the West Loop. He also was a large landowner around where Harpo was, all the way to the Plumbers Union. He owned all of that land. He was a remarkable man. He rode his horseback like 4 days to come from upstate New York to come to Chicago. And it looks like my slides just went away. That's okay. I've got a backup right here. All right. I talked about Philo Carpenter, and the next person I'm going to talk about is Mary Bartlemay. Has anyone ever heard of her? Mary Bartlemay. Okay, Mary Bartlemay was the first female judge in Illinois. She grew up around where Fulton market signs are at Fulton and Halstead. She really looked after children, and she kept suitcases in her office for kids that didn't have clothes when there were court cases. She was known as Suitcase Mary. And this is our beloved park that's across the street from where I live. It opened in 2010, and my husband and I remember it was coming for at least 15 years. It was coming. And it finally came, and it has transformed the neighborhood. It is a real hub for just about everything in the neighborhood, and we're honoring Mary Bartlemay with this park. Does anyone recognize the Fountain of the Great Lakes? It's a beautiful fountain just south of the Art Institute. This is something else that I found out. Mr. Benjamin lived in the Jackson Historic District, and the house is still there. And he was a very wealthy lumberman. He donated the money for this park. Thank you, Mr. Benjamin Ferguson. This park is one of the most beautiful parks in Chicago. Father Mac. Many of you probably remember Skid Row. Anybody drive through Skid Row or remember it? Down Madison Street. I remember coming here with a corporate job in the late 80s and going to a hockey game. First hockey game. And I was traveling with people going down the street. And they said, don't look out the window and keep the doors locked. And now I live in that neighborhood, which is kind of amazing. Father Mac has a sign on Washington Street, and he ministered to all of these people with many addictions. He believed everyone was a child of God and that everyone should get a second chance. He went on to form the McDermott Center, which is still over there on Washington and about Carpenter. And if you know also a little bit about him, he was a true White Sox fan. All right, of course we know about Oprah. Oprah, we remember when she came, my husband and I, she made the neighborhood okay. It was in the late 80s. She actually even had an apartment over there. She did make the neighborhood okay. She made it safer and so forth. She was, I would say, one of the pioneers in the area. I think what's really interesting about where she was, Harpo, at the corner of Carpenter and Washington, it's now McDonald's worldwide headquarters. I think even more important, it was Oprah. Before that, the Fred Niles movie studio. And before that, it was an armory. And it was the morgue for the Eastland disaster. I'm hoping someday there will be some sort of a plaque put on that building so we don't forget what happened there. David Chase lives in the neighborhood. He developed a couple old printing and binding factories, and they're now condos today. They were not torn down. And have any of you ever been to the Epiphany Episcopal Church at the corner of Adams and Ashland? Anybody? Okay. Well, it's no longer a church. It closed in 2005. But David Chase and his wife, they bought the building and after that. And they have developed it into an art center where they have live music, they have theater, they have art installations, they have photography exhibit, and if I can get my husband to go, we swing dance there on Sunday nights. David and his wife were married there, and he did not want the church to not do well. So he repurposed it, and I'm gonna show you in a minute, if you drive by, it has the signature red door. Orlando Murden, anybody, probably you know his song that he wrote, For Once in My Life. He wrote that song, and he lived in the Skid Row area, Troop and Ada. And the house is still there. It's a beautiful white stone. Phyllis Bramson, an artist, she recently had an exhibit at the Elmhurst Art Museum. She's lived in the neighborhood by herself since the early 1980s. She was a professor in art at UIC. And she said she never had an issue. There were just, stray dogs, prostitutes, and she would go to Greektown to hang out. She was one of those very modern women. She lived in the studio and painted in her apartment during the week, and then she commutes to the suburbs on the weekends. And she's still doing that, which I think is pretty interesting. I mentioned Oprah. This is a mural that is on the side of a building that used to be, do you remember H2O Cosmetics? That was there, and before that, it was the sewer department. Anyway, it's now, yeah, that's kind of funny. Anyway, now it's a new condo building called The Port, and Oprah has a mural on the side of it. I mentioned, or I didn't mention, Annie and Louis Costner. They used to live in our old building, which was 1908, 7-story brick building. That was their only condo building. They bought up, more than a dozen buildings in the West Loop. They were abandoned and empty. They were old manufacturing buildings because our area was manufacturing. They didn't displace anyone, and they turned them into rental units, and then eventually now they're condos. And they're 7-story brick buildings, solid as a rock, because they were built for manufacturing. Annie and Louis were very instrumental in me writing this book. They said, if you don't do it, this is all going to be gone, and people will never know what happened over in this area. Annie told me stories when they were first starting in the 80s. She said they had no sewers, no stop signs, no grocery stores, no traffic lights. And she would take a VCR tape to Mayor Daley's office and drop it off and said, we need sewers, we need stop signs. And it got attention. They really worked hard to restore this area. This sign is still on one of the buildings. That's how they used to advertise. It was called Annie Properties. And they used to put their signs on all the water towers that were in the West Loop. And I believe this is the last sign that's left. The businesses that were then, the garment industry was huge. Wagons, I mentioned bicycles. The Schwinn bicycle was at Peoria and Lake. And now, ironically, there's a high-end bicycle company. They don't manufacture about a block away, and Specialized Bicycles has opened about 2 blocks away. So I guess maybe history does a full circle and repeats itself. I mentioned that bindery and printing was over in our area. A lot of the buildings that have been converted were bindery and printing buildings. Regensteiner helped develop 3-color printing. There were many kitchen products. This was my mom's. It's an Echo cake pan. Anybody have one? You might want to take a look at home. They were made just a few blocks from where I live. And next door was the Allen Company, and Mr. Allen lived in Oak Park. He had a kitchen studio on the 2nd floor of his building. It's kind of hard to imagine. And now, as you know, we have a lot of restaurants. He also sold things to make frostings and fondant and all kinds of kitchen products. The buildings are both still there. Entertainment was huge in our neighborhood. By the Mid-City Bank were hundreds, or not hundreds, tens of burlesque clubs that were on Halsted. It was a thriving area for entertainment. I mentioned the garment industry. This was the Form Fit company. Anyone know those bras and girdles? They were just down the block from where I live at Peoria and Van Buren. And if you could imagine, they put up a sign, a billboard in the 60s after 290 was built with a woman, bra and panties, and it caused some accidents on 290. And who knew that the push-up bra would save them during the Depression, which I found really interesting. That building is now a UIC building, and it also has there's some professors that have classrooms there. This Every Minute Counts. This was a photo from World War II, a few blocks from where I live. The gentleman there had a hair salon for the women because their husbands were off to the war. And he also wanted them to wear red nail polish. So when they were doing this tedious work, they would not cut their hands and their fingers. And I thought, how forward thinking. And this was in the 40s. This company is now gone, but I think of all these people that worked there. Wagons, Shuttler Wagons. Mr. Shuttler lived in the neighborhood and was known for his orchids. He had a big mansion. Unfortunately, it's been torn down. But his wagons transported Mormons to Utah. He was a big deal, Mr. Shuttler. The businesses now. Technology, we all know Google's over there, McDonald's. Music is still over in our neighborhood. Lion and Healy harps are still there. The city winery is still there. We have a music school, the Merritt School of Music, and I believe one of the founders was from Oak Park. And then, of course, the Epiphany Center for the Arts has music almost every night. We have a lot of restaurants. As you probably know, that's kind of what we're known for now. There's one block between Randolph and Fulton on the west side that within the 1 block area, there's 6 Michelin stars, which is pretty amazing. I mentioned Lyon and Healy. The building is beautiful. If you ever get an opportunity to go to a concert there, they're very worthwhile. The harps are handmade. It's an unbelievable place. Fulton Market, that's where Mary Bartlemay lived, right at the entrance of Fulton Market, which is now restaurants, and it's not open to traffic. The Painters Union, there's still a lot of unions in the West Loop. And right next door is where Florence Ziegfeld lived. This is actually a very beautiful building. But this isn't the only union. There's also the Electrical Union, which, by the way, used to be the West End Women's Club. And I understand there's some connections to this club. I don't think it's in business anymore, but a group of women started it, and they funded it themselves. And they had lots of music events. The auditorium is still there, and the electrical union is there, and there's murals on the side of the building. It's in a lot of disrepair, but it is a very historic building. The Painters Union, as I mentioned, is still there. The Plumbers Union is still there. The Garment Workers Union is still there. Teamsters is still there. Tool and Die is still there. There's a lot of unions. And we're wondering how long they will stay because the land is so valuable. And they have, of course, purchased it when it was really, really cheap. A lot of people think the West Loop happened overnight. It didn't. It's taken about 40 years. And I like to point out that not everything's been torn down. There is a lot of new. We live in a 1908 7-story brick building that used to house, it was a book depository for Chicago public schools. And before that, it was offices for the garment district because it was so nearby. I did find an ad online that way back when they said women need not apply to be in sales. Things have changed a little bit. This is a delightful building on Peoria called the Taylor Building, and it was a garment building. And I think these little statuettes on the front are so cute, and no one hardly sees them. It looks like Benjamin Franklin sewing. I just think they're beautiful. They cleaned this building up about 10 years ago, and it's now used as a dorm for college students. Thank goodness they didn't tear it down. These are a couple other buildings that have had many lives. The Alice building, where they made belts for the automotive business. That is now the hip Soho House. The Free Methodist Publishing House, yes, they did publish some brochures for the Methodist Church. Before that, it was the Casket Factory. After that, it was the Holography Museum. And today, a young couple from Australia bought it, and it's a really nice B&B with a basement in the bottom. So it's nice to see that some of these buildings have not been torn down. And of course, we have two longtime churches in the neighborhood. Old St. Pat's, which is the oldest church, public building in the United States, 1856. And then I mentioned the First Congregational Baptist Church on Ashland, where you can see that steeple as you drive down Ashland Street. By the way, they have one of the oldest Kimball organs in the world. And it's beautiful. I've been there. In case you wanted to hear a little bit more, I talked about the Plumbers Union. They have some of the first wooden pipes in Chicago, and they're in the basement of their building, which I think is pretty cool. They're also in the book. Carter Harrison, too, his father was 5-time mayor, has a big statue in Union Park, shut down the Everleigh Club, as some of you may remember that, on South Dearborn, a notorious brothel. The Eastland Morgue, as I mentioned, was where Harpo was. And some of you probably remember the disco demolition at the White Sox field. That was hatched at Barney's restaurant over a dinner there. And Barney's, they used to call people when they came in, yes, sir, Mr. Senator. And that building is still there. Barney's is gone, but it's at the corner of Halsted and Randolph. So there's a few more tidbits, and there's much, much more in the book. I really had fun researching it. We have such terrific libraries in Chicago. Thank goodness I had done my 100 interviews before COVID, and much of the rest I was able to do online and going to Harold Washington. I even used Oak Park Library for a couple things too. I appreciate your interest, and I thank you. And what kind of questions can I answer for you?
So I just want to let you know that one of those wooden pipes is right here in Oak Park. It is at the Oak Park River Forest Museum.
Oh.
It's about this big around. Yeah, and it's a length of about this big. And when you tell people this was a water pipe, they look at you like you're crazy. Because why would you try and shoot water through the middle of a wooden pipe? Wouldn't the wood absorb it or anything? Well, it's covered periodically with iron rings that hold the shape, so that the wood can only swell so much.
That's very interesting. They did not tell me that. Yes.
What are the current parameters of the West Loop?
That is a good
Boundaries.
question, and I actually put that in the book. See if I can. There's a page in the book because I had to do that. Otherwise, the book would be 500 pages. So I made my own boundaries. Real estate agents have made theirs as well. My boundaries are Jefferson, very close to Old St. Pat's, and it's where house music got started. That's on the east side. On the west side, roughly Ashland. On the north side, Fulton Market. A few years ago, it would have been Randolph, but now a Fulton Market has become so popular. And then on the south side, the south side is 290, Van Buren. But all those highways, came way after the West Loop started, or the near west side, the 1960s. I know my husband thinks it should cut off at the freeway, 90, but it wasn't here then. You have to include Old St. Pat's, I believe, and you have to include house music, because it was started over in the West Loop. Any other questions that I can answer for you? Yes?
You talked about one of your first slides about honoring your ancestors.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what information did you find out about indigenous peoples?
Not much over there. Almost nothing. I have to say, maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I found very little out. But I think, has anyone seen the new movie that's out? The woman won the Golden Globe last night. Watch that movie about Osage County in Oklahoma. My sister lives nearby. Really cool.
Killers of the Flower Moon.
That's it, Killers of the Flower Moon. Yes?
Not really a question, just a comment, since you mentioned the Everly Club.
Yes.
There's a wonderful book called Sin in the Second City, which is the history of the Everly Club, and it's a
have it.
great read.
It is. I wish somebody would do a play about that. I think it's got everything to be a great play. South Dearborn. That was the whole levee district. It's a really fascinating time. It was a real high-end brothel. And Carter Harrison II was at a governor's meeting, and they were passing out brochures to advertise their wares, I guess, and he got embarrassed, and that's why he shut it down. Everybody was in on it, the politicians, lawyers. Yeah, it's a really good read. Any other questions? Yes?
Current development and restoration, friction or working together?
That's interesting. We have a building that it was a restaurant a long time in Greektown, because the area used to be known as Greektown too, and it's now a 7-story. It was Santorini. It's now a 7-story apartment building. The neighborhood groups do get together, and it did shrink from 12 to 7. We've been there for a long time, but we still have our view of the downtown because it's 7 floors instead of 12. But there is some friction. From a fiscal standpoint, I worry that there's too much building. It's all rentals, which you need to be invested in where you live, and people come and go a lot. But there's a lot of corporate headquarters now, which pays a lot of taxes and so forth. I'm hoping that our the Chamber of Commerce and everybody, really thinks this through, because it just seems like there is a new crane every day. But there are still some buildings that have not been torn down. I guess progress is good, and neighborhoods, I'm not a city planner, but neighborhoods do go through cycles. They do. We're on an up cycle right now, but we've seen a downturn too with 2008. Hopefully we'll stay. We like living there. Yes? Another question? I love all your questions. Thank you.
What would you think the population has changed since you moved in versus today?
It's probably 5 times as much. A lot. It's mostly families with kids. We have a really good public elementary school, Skinner Elementary. We have a great high school, but it's a magnet school, Whitney Young. It's families, I believe. And I think also because you can walk to the Loop to work, if anybody's going to work these days. The population's changed a lot. You have to have parking stickers everywhere. You can't find parking. There's crime, unfortunately. There's trash on the street, which is kind of sad. But the population's changed a lot. And I don't know right offhand what the amount is, but I bet it's 5 or 6 times. I see my husband sitting next to you. Kirk, do you have any ideas on the population? He's an actuary.
That's probably right. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say, it went from maybe 1,000 up to 10,000 now, so maybe a little bit more, but it's part of the new 34th ward.
Yeah. We have a new Alderman Conway. He and his staff, I have to say, are amazing. They come to our park and our farmers market every Saturday. And so we know that he knows us face to face, which is really kind of amazing, and it's really wonderful. He really loves our neighborhood. And believe it or not, people don't realize this. We have a very diverse neighborhood. Many Indians, many Asians. We have lots of, it's very diverse, I think partly because Rush Hospital is so close to all the medical community. But we love the diversity. I love the diversity. That's why I live in the city. Any other questions?
What's the name of the park?
Mary Bartlemay Park. Yes, and there's a big plaque inside the park. It's actually in the book too, where it talks a little bit about her history. And if you're interested in more history, I also used the daily library at UIC. I had never been in there. And they have archives of Mary Bartlemay, which is pretty cool. We have, as you all know, we have great libraries in Chicago. I would run into people at the History Museum, at the Newberry, at Harold Washington, from all over the world. And the Harold Washington really has great special collections on neighborhoods. And my book is in there now because all this information was in bits and pieces everywhere, and now it's in a book.
Are there any more questions? We have a little bit more time.
Okay.
Is there anything controversial in your book?
Well, I heard some stories that I decided not to repeat. It's a historical book. It's not meant to be a tell-all, and there are a few things. I mean, I'll tell you, this is in the book. Mr. Beidler had this huge mansion a few blocks from where we live. It's now Walsh Construction, one of the largest construction companies in the world. He also had a brothel on Halsted. I have to tell you one other funny story. I met one of the meat packers. One of the commercial developers introduced me to him, and we're still friends. He came right out of high school from the south side of Chicago and opened a packing house. He did quite well. He sold it a few years ago for a couple $1 million. Anyway, he told me it was so bad in the area that they couldn't get potholes fixed, so they would... This is the story. They would fill them with pancake mix. And he also told me there was a restaurant in the basement of one of those buildings, and there was this cook. It depended if she was in a good mood or a bad mood, if she burned the food. And sometimes her cigarette butt would land in the soup. So there were some funny stories, too, that I heard, and some heartbreaking, like Dr. Shipman. Any other questions?
With the Obama Presidential Library being under development in Hyde Park and Michelle growing up in West Loop area, is there any restoration or preservation area of Michelle's origins?
She didn't grow up in the West Loop. She just went to high school there. She lived in the South Shore neighborhood. But I will tell you a little West Loop connection in the Obamas. Does anyone remember Wishbone Restaurant? Oh, yeah. The Obamas, before he was president, senator, went there every Saturday morning with their little girls. The owner has moved it east to Jefferson and Randolph, and he knew them quite well. Were you surprised about what you've learned today? Yeah. No, every history has neighborhood. If you just, every neighborhood has history. If you just look around, it's there. It's hard for me to go by a building and not find out what happened there. And you can do that a lot. I have a Sanborn map downstairs that you can go online and look at what was there before you. Before Mary Bartlemay was a park, it was a hospital. Yeah, pretty interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Connie. I feel we've learned a lot.
Good. Thank you for being a great audience.